Last week, the bookies backed Reform to win the Caerphilly by-election. They were wrong. Voters came out in their droves to elect Welsh nationalist party Plaid Cymru. Still a crushing result for Labour, but also a glimmer of hope. Reform is beatable. But is Keir Starmer the man for the job? Harry, you went to Caerphilly last week to cover this by-election. Was the result seen as a blow to Reform? Because they still came a strong second.
Yeah, I think you do have to contextualise it. Caerphilly is a place that for over a century had only chose Labour at the ballot box. But it did seem that there was a lot of momentum behind the campaign, not least in the media about what it could mean. But it was definitely a bit of a blow. Nigel Farage came up to the constituency on the Get Out the Vote day, polling day.
And he'd been there
before as well, and was really adding to the cause. And there was in the town this sort of excitement, and that was reflected in the turnout. Was 50.4% compared to, I think, around 41 at the 2021 Senedd election. Yeah. But it was definitely a blow. Llŷr Paw didn't take it particularly well. That's the Reform candidate. Exactly, and didn't take too kindly to my questioning. But in terms of Plaid, they definitely did decimate the Labour vote share, but they seem to be a bit caught up into what this means in the grand scheme of things. So I spoke to Rhyn ap Iawef, who is the leader of Plaid, after the count, and he said that there definitely was a tactical voting element at play here, and that's what took them over the line. But then he did also make a very bold claim that through Labour's downfall, Plaid has now become the default voice of the left in Wales, which seems a bit contradictory that, you know, you can't necessarily have it both ways and accepting that tactical voting took you so far, but also we are better than Labour on their own terms that they argue. I mean, so if you actually look at the results, it was 11% for Labour. But if you look at the polling in Wales, rather than it actually being 11%, our Britain Predicts model shows that the Labour vote is actually around 23% and that the Plaid vote is on 29%. So when it comes to the Senedd elections next year, there will be, I suppose, this question of how much momentum the Caerphilly result will actually bring Plaid forward. And for context as well, Reform is on 35%. So there is still a gap between Plaid that will need to be closed to Reform.
Yeah, using Labour. Yeah. And actually, I just wanted to ask you a bit about your conversation with the Reform candidate, because you asked him, was there any sort of level of embarrassment that he felt because he hadn't won this by-election that, you know, Reform were being bigged up to win well. I heard from a source, and you can correct me because you were actually there, that they, you know, Reform were making a lot of noise in the centre of the town. They had a building there with billboards that changed its messages each day. Nigel Farage was helicoptered in, I think. There were expensive direct, you know, mail-out campaigns for leaflets to go around voters. That's a lot of money to spend and a lot of attention to bring to this campaign that actually didn't come off for them. Was it an embarrassment for them, do you think? I know that's what you asked their candidate.
Yes. I think, again, it would have been a very momentous moment for Reform to, you know, go to South Wales, a traditionally left-leaning place, and then to seize this momentum. But I think when you do kind of take it in the round, I think you mentioned, Anoosh, to me when you were first contacted about this, about the big digital advertising that I did see. It was by a four-way junction, so all the traffic, Piccadilly Circus style in Caerphilly. But yeah, there was a lot of discussion about it. And, you know, some of the issues that Powell raised was echoing a lot of Welsh sentiment, the polling shows, on particular wedge issues that are being blamed on Labour. So, for example, the 20 mile per hour speed limit, particularly Labour's handling of the NHS in Wales, and just the general cost of living, visible decline and all of that stuff. And Reform did have a lot of momentum behind it, but some of Powell's, the way he carried himself, some of the ways he spoke about immigration, for example, on the BBC candidate debates prior to the elections, he sort of, this despite the fact that 2.9% of those living in Caerphilly are born outside the UK. His comments were seen as really abrasive. It seemed to have alienated a lot of people, especially women voters as well, and that might have suppressed some effort. So I think considering everything in the round, you know, we still can't underplay how many votes they did get, 12,000. But yes, it perhaps was one that was hard to take for the Reform machine, considering what the polling is saying.
Yeah, and George, I mean, how is this how is the fallout from this by-election being seen in Number 10? Is it a message of reform is actually beatable, or is it that, Welsh Labour is dead and what we're going to do about it?
Well, I think they certainly recognise they've got big problems in Wales and big problems across the UK. I mean, Labour lost there for a lot of the same reasons that it's unpopular in England and Scotland too at the moment. But yes, in terms of reform being beatable, Number 10 look at the by-elections so far this Parliament. Reform won narrowly in Runcorn, 6 votes. They lost in the Hamilton by-election in Scotland. Now they've lost in Wales too. So though they're leading in the polls, they're not currently polling winning votes at the level that an opposition party normally needs to be confident of just sweeping to victory and winning a majority. And clearly, we see from the increased turnouts in Caerphilly and the surge in Plaid's vote that being seen as Reform's main opponent is a big asset if you're a party of the centre or the centre-left. You're seeing that from the Lib Dems' performance in council by-elections as well. So that suggests that Number 10's strategy of framing Labour as the anti-reform party is the correct electoral choice. But they still have to give voters positive reasons to vote for them. Because I think if it's a disillusioned electorate and you have a right-wing vote consolidated around reform and a more centre, left-leaning one fragmented, Labour, SNP, Greens, Plaid, then the result's a reform government.
Yeah, and it's hard to do tactical voting, isn't it, when you don't know which the party is that will be the one to block reform from winning in your seat.
Exactly. I mean, particularly in this era of 7-party politics, where constituency polls are not always reliable, and some of these contests are going to be 3-way marginals, and so and we were also assuming that Labour will still clearly be the main challenger to reform. I mean, clearly, Zach Polanski's Greens are aiming to change that. Yes, on paper they're starting as the leading party in more than 400 constituencies, but the next election is years away, and so as I said, they do need to focus on sort of positive delivery and governing well, I think, rather than just relying on tactical votes. And that's certainly Number 10's view.
Yeah, and Plaid won an 11% margin of victory over reform, bigger than Labour's entire vote share, Harry. So does that mean that a coalition government is the only way forward for the left in Wales?
It is a topic that I did pick up with Reen at PLF. He did mention that the Welsh nationalists have leaned towards making informal agreements, potentially with the Greens and Labour, but there has been a lot of bad blood between Plaid and Labour. I remember Senedd Morgan, who's the First Minister of Wales, mentioned at party conference, I think, when comparing Plaid and Reform, she said, different poison, same bottle. So there is definitely a bit of animosity, but that said, if you look at the polling right now, there is still a gap for Plaid to catch up with. And as much as they're banking on using the momentum from Caerphilly to try and close the gap to reform, ultimately, if no one is able to get a majority control of the Senedd, then, they are going to have to look towards that. And so I suppose what they're looking to do following this is to strengthen their position, Plaid, politically, so that when it does come to a discussion of a coalition, that it is perhaps done on more favourable terms, both in terms of seats, but I suppose politically in terms of picking up on this idea that following Caerphilly, that Welsh Labour is dead.
Yeah, did you get any idea from the Welsh Labour figures that you spoke to when you were there, whether or not they would prop up a Plaid government? Not the kind of thing they would want to talk about, no. I suppose. But if they are to be one of the parties blocking reform, that might be the reality.
Yes, so I spoke to Hugh Rankin-Davies, who is the Deputy First Minister of Wales, just before the official results were declared, but we already knew what was going to happen. So he was quite able to speak to the situation facing his party. And he was quite forthright. He thinks that Welsh Labour are, quote, underdogs, and that there is the scope to come back even ahead of the Senedd elections next May. And I don't know, that particular line really struck me as that the party who is in control in Cardiff and is also in control in Westminster is the underdog. But so I think from the Labour side, it's seen as a non-starter, and I think that is somewhat the problem with Welsh Labour's disposition, in that, you know, not trying to have a reckoning or a proper sense of introspection over this. It's maybe just a case of we need to talk about things in a better way, which very much echoes the national Labour narrative. So, but in terms of Labour's positioning, it's still of the idea that we can still get the job done and we can turn things around.
Yeah, is that kind of the narrative that you hear from Number 10 about these sort of challenges from the left, George? You know, perhaps not as much introspection as there should be about, you know, the potential Jeremy Corbyn or whoever led your party, the Greens under Zach Polansky, you know, what's happening with Plaid in Wales.
They don't see the next election in those terms. I mean, they've got obviously still a landslide majority at Westminster, and I also think first past the post has worked pretty well for Labour, and the style of politics that Keir Starmer's pursued is quite different to that say someone like Andy Burnham is championing, and he's obviously explicitly said he wants a sort of progressive alliance. I think in terms of Labour, and there's obviously been speculation over whether the party strategy has changed after Keir Starmer's conference speech, and whether they're shifting away from an approach focused on so-called hero voters. You know, that was lower middle class voters who'd backed Boris Johnson's Tories in 2019 and voted Brexit before that in sort of Middle England constituencies, and whether they're now pivoting towards a focus on, you know, progressive voters. No, I think that's been overread, and they've always rejected the idea that they're solely focused on reform voters, because they say, you know, we've done an EU reset deal. We've backed clean power. We're expanding workers' rights. We're increasing public spending. We're raising taxes on the wealthy and so on. These are all things that progressives tend to like. So they think that you can find common ground between, you know, progressives and between perhaps more reform curious voters, particularly on the economy and public services.
Yeah, and just one thing before we go to our break. There was a little bit of a change in tone in that conference speech that Keir Starmer made, particularly in terms of some of the hostile narratives that we're hearing from the right and the hard right about ethnicity and diversity in this country. It struck me that Wes Streeting, the health secretary, came out with quite a robust, almost a speech actually, against some comments that Sarah Pochin, a Reform MP, made over the weekend. What did that tell us? Was that a sort of strategic thing, or is that just Wes being Wes?
Well, I think he was very moved by the comments from school children in his constituency the Friday before that interview about their experience of racism. And he's felt this for a while in his seat in Ilford North, that you are seeing a resurgence of racism more associated with the 1970s and 1980s, real overt racism on the streets of a kind that people probably thought had disappeared, or at least become far more marginal.
I did an FOI recently, and I found a 67% rise of racist attacks on public transport since 2022. So there's definitely been a marked increase.
Yeah. And so I think it was partly about that. But look, strategically, Streeting believes Labour absolutely has to stand up for progressive values against reform, and that there can be no equivocation on this. And I think that's a message you also heard in Keir Starmer's conference speech. But there has been some criticism since that Labour was too slow to criticise the Tory MP Katie Lamb, for instance, when she said the deportation of legal migrants would create a more culturally cohesive country. What you saw with Sarah Pochin was actually Labour respond very quickly, unambiguously, and I think as a consequence has had reform on the Tories on the back foot over this.
And for those of our listeners and viewers who haven't seen the comments that she made, she was speaking on a Talk TV interview when a caller called in and complained about the demographics of advertising. She said, "It drives me mad when I see adverts full of black people, full of Asian people."
So Pochin issued a sort of semi-apology for her comments, saying they were phrased poorly. And then the Tories had the embarrassment of Chris Philp refusing 6 times to say whether he considered them racist, and then doing another interview shortly afterwards in which he said they were. Yeah. So I think that shows the advantage when you're the government and you have that platform and you condemn your opponents in clear terms, then that does give you political advantage.
And of course, Streeting is often talked up as a potential, future Labour leader, alternative candidate to Keir Starmer. I mean, if Reform is beatable, doesn't it just then beg the question, is Starmer the man for the job to beat them? If they're beatable but not with Keir Starmer, should someone else be in that top seat?
That's definitely the question he's going to have to answer over the next year. I think most Labour MPs still see May 26 as the biggest test of his leadership since the election. That's when you've got the contests in Wales, Scotland, London and other major cities. And if Labour lost very badly in all of those, then that does leave Starmer in a tricky position. But look, allies would say, don't write off the May elections in advance. We can use governments to deliver positive changes. But certainly, look, the polling's very grim for Labour at the moment, and you do need to see improvement.
From my vox popping with people in Caerphilly, it was very clear to me that, brand Starmer itself has been quite a toxifying force for people. When I was trying to discern where this result lied, whether it was because of Welsh Labour and their perceived ineffectiveness in government, or whether it was of the national government, Starmer's name kept coming up. And I think the challenge for Streeting, if he is the man to take on Reform, and he is a great speaker, he can give as good as he gets and can certainly challenge Farage, is maybe his close association with the Starmer government, as one of the most recognisable cabinet figures alongside Rachel Reeves. And so I suppose if he is to come to the fore, his main challenge will be differentiating himself and defining himself on his own terms, and not perhaps just being seen as a re-microwaved branch of Starmerism.
Yeah.